policy change is complicated. There's so many interfering factors. There's no way someone could prove that the thing they did led directly to that major policy change.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector. Let's get started. Hello, listeners. This is Curtis Schmidt, producer of NPFX, the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Before the end of the year, we wanted to drop one final episode into the feed. Today, I have for you another great interview in our series on narrative strategy. This time, Josh Gryniewicz, Chief Narrative Strategist at Odd Duck, interviews Brett Davidson. Brett is a narrative change expert who spent his career helping social justice organizations understand how stories and culture shape real-world outcomes and how to measure when change is happening. If you've been listening to this series, you know that narrative strategy is becoming increasingly important for nonprofits that want to create lasting, meaningful change. Personal stories still matter, but the underlying narratives that shape how people make sense of the world matter even more. In this episode, Josh and Brett explore a question that comes up again and again in nonprofit leadership, boardrooms, and funding conversations. Okay, we understand that narrative change is important, but how do we know if it's actually working? In other words, how do we measure the impact of our narrative change strategy? Here are some of the key ideas to listen for in Josh's interview with Brett. Brett describes a metaphor of concentric ripples in a pond. It's a way to think about measuring narrative change over time, starting with things you can measure within your organization and expanding to broader cultural shifts to watch for. It's a powerful framework, especially for organizations that don't have massive research budgets but still need credible ways to assess progress. You'll also hear Brett draw an important distinction between attribution and contribution. Narrative change rarely happens because of a single organization acting alone. So instead of asking, did we cause this change? Brett encourages nonprofits to ask, what did we contribute alongside others that helped make this change possible? That shift can be especially important when talking to funders. And that idea of contribution also connects closely to our previous episode on power ecosystems and how collaboration between organizations within a community can strengthen both the impact that they have and their fundraising efforts. I encourage you to listen to that episode if you haven't already. So if narrative change feels essential, but maybe a little hard to define, hard to measure, or hard to defend in a budget conversation, this episode will give you practical language, frameworks, and advice for implementing it more effectively in your organization. And with that, here's Josh's conversation with Brett Davidson. Take it away, Josh.
Welcome, Brett, to NPFX. I'm thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
I would love to actually start with a bit about how you got into narrative change work in the first place, what that looks like, and some of your history.
Yeah, well, I started my career in radio at the South African Broadcasting Corporation when we were transitioning from apartheid system to democracy. So it was an interesting time. But I think, working on the radio and interviewing newsmakers, it was obvious to me that people who could tell a good story were really, engaging, and you'd want to listen to them and carry on listening to them. And, when I interviewed people from nonprofits, I often didn't understand what they were talking about because they were full of jargon and abstract words like capacity building and empowerment. And I kept asking, well, what do you do? And they kept repeating these words. And I realized that, when I moved on from radio and started to work in the nonprofit world, I realized that, if I can help people tell stories, that would be of great benefit to many people because, it just helps convey your message and, helps you connect with people. So it really started off in storytelling and working with people and helping people to understand how everyone has a story, but not everyone knows how to tell a story well, right? It's a skill. And then from working in storytelling and working with groups of activists all around the world in training and storytelling, started to realize that there's something more fundamental going on, and I think it was often, in the human rights world, realizing that we talk about human rights and the human rights world, although I was focused on storytelling, is very fact-based, right? We tell people the facts, we tell people how bad everything is, and we just assume that with that knowledge, they're going to change. And we're running against this wall, like facts are not enough, facts are not helping, facts are not moving people. Telling people about the bad stuff in the world is not getting them to change anything. Storytelling was one way of trying to address that, but understanding that facts are important, but you have to tell a story that helps people make sense of the facts. You have to tell a story that everyone has this kind of view of the world, which we then call a narrative, right? A narrative about how the world works, what makes sense in the world. And unless we also grapple with that and try and shift that underlying narrative, then we can tell people as many facts as they like. But as we know now from lots of research that's been done, they'll reject the facts because it doesn't fit their worldview. It doesn't fit the narrative they have about the world. And of course, since about 2016, I think we've seen this play out in the US dramatically, but in other parts of the world as well. That we have to actually grapple with the narrative. And so, for example, in my work at OSF, one of the narratives we were trying to shift is how do we help people understand medicines as public goods instead of private goods that anyone can sell at whatever price they can get for it. Can we change the narrative and help people start to think of access to medicines, access to healthcare as a right, as a public good? But there's a narrative, particularly in this country, that like health is a personal responsibility. That it's that you blame people for their health because they didn't make the right decisions. And so we had to grapple with that narrative. We had to grapple with the narrative of capitalism. That it's a business like anything else, and people should sell it at whatever price they can get for that. And so unless we can't really achieve policy change unless we start to shift and try and grapple with these underlying narratives. So that's how I really got into it, and then started to think more about these narratives as kind of worldviews. Culture. How do we change culture? How do we change these underlying assumptions that underlying many of the issues we're trying to grapple with?
Fantastic! What an excellent introduction. Thank you, Brett. And you've written a lot on just different narrative approaches and sort of underlying philosophy of this narrative change work. And one of the pieces that really resonated with me, it was for the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it was a piece specifically on measuring narrative change. And so that's what I'd really love to explore. And I'd love to start, actually, if you want to share sort of what you put across in that article, so that everybody, we'll include a link in the show notes and everything, but that everybody listening can have sort of a ground to start from.
Well, I think one of the things that prompted that article, and as you mentioned, funders keep coming up with this question, well, how do we measure it? And it got very frustrating, and still is often, when you try to persuade people to invest in narrative change, and this question kept coming up, but how do we know it's working? How do we know how do we measure its impact? Particularly if we say that narrative change can take years, right, to happen. And I started to get frustrated and wonder if it was really a genuine question, because people kept asking the question, but then wouldn't put the resources into actually doing the work to get the answer. But then it's like, okay, well, then let's try and answer that question. But I was also wanting to answer the question, thinking about, an average small nonprofit who can't afford to spend like $200,000 doing a massive research project, right? And like, how can a small organization trying to achieve some kind of narrative change or work in this field do something to assess if they're headed in the right direction and kind of assess their impact? Not only because we want their work to be effective, but also to make that argument to funders, to say, well, look, we've been doing this work, because funders are going to say, well, what happened, from the money that we gave you? So I started to think about this kind of idea, metaphor of a kind of ripple in a pond, So starting out close to your organization, in time and space, and say, okay, what are the first things we could look for in that first ripple? Then how do we move out from that, progressively as time goes on? And so to me, it was, well, one of the first things we can do is say, well, do we have alternative narratives? Do we have a coherent plan? What are the frameworks and narratives that we've developed that are, that we're promoting? Because I think often people talk about narrative change, but then which audience are you trying to reach, right? Like a narrative among who, among whom, among which audience? What are you going to be looking for? A change amongst which group? What kind of change? So do you have a clear plan is one clear thing to do, which is, fairly easy to do, and it doesn't take much money. Then also, are we building alliances? Are people aligning with you on this? Are you able to agree on a set of narratives that you want to promote? What does that look like? Because again, I think one of the accusations that often happens, particularly in kind of liberal organizations, is that everyone has their own different message, their own different narrative.
Right.
So are we able to build a coalition? And we found this with our work on medicines, access to medicines and medicine pricing. Every organization had its own framework, its own messages, its own strategy. And it takes a lot of work to build a coalition and say, oh, we all agree, this is the narrative we're trying to change. This is the framework. These are the metaphors we want to, push and get people aligned on that. So that's a work in itself. So is that happening? Are we seeing people being aligned? Do we have an agreed set of frameworks we can all get on board with? And then, are we seeing the people that we're trying to impact, whether it's journalists, whether it's people in our circle, experts in the field of medicines, are we seeing them start to come on board and reflect that messaging, reflect that narrative, use the words that we're trying to get them to use? And, you can do this. It doesn't have to be expensive or even super rigorous, but, you can turn on a TV and say, okay, is this person who's writing, or open a newspaper, is this person who's writing about this issue starting to pick up this framework? Are they starting to use it? You could see this, for example, in this country when people started to promote the idea of talking about undocumented people, right, instead of illegal or, immigrants and so on. Then AP changed style guide. Well, that's a clear indication something's happened. It worked, right?
Right.
That doesn't take a lot of money to figure out that AP changed its style guide, to just, you can, it happened, and you can see how, there's a style guide, you can read it and see. So those kinds of things, are you monitoring for those kinds of things and picking them up? It doesn't take a lot of money. One example in South Africa with a sex work group, they figured that they were starting to change the narrative when journalists started to ask them, instead of asking these kind of really inappropriate questions about like, how many men do you sleep with every day? They had really got these awful questions from journalists. But then it started to change, and journalists were starting to ask about their rights, and kind of the law and how the law's changing, and are they winning? So that the whole kinds of questions they were getting from journalists started to shift. And then there was one incident, I think, where they were in Parliament, and they overheard, some member of Parliament asked a question about prostitution, and another member of Parliament kind of elbowed them in the ribs and said, no, we could talk about sex work. And so they realized, okay, people are starting to change, right? This discourse is changing. And then we started to see journalists talk about sex work more, not prostitution. And so you can see that that people pick that up.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't take a lot of money. What it does take is a plan, and looking out for those things, and kind of being sure you gather them and store them, and so that you then can monitor, and so that you kind of have that, you're documenting it and so on, instead of just kind of randomly looking around when funders ask you, say, oh, what do we say?
Right.
So I think it does take resources, it does take time, and then building that into your work plan, I think, is important.
Do you identify some of these like sensors or signals in advance that you're looking for?
Yes, I think you can think about, what kind of things are we going to be looking for? And, I think organizations working on migration would, their aim maybe was to get AP to change its style guide. It did. So that's like, we had it as our aim. They've done it. It's something we'd be looking out for. So I think, yes, you could say, there's certain changes we hope would happen, so we can look out for those. But I think as well, be open to other things that you haven't necessarily anticipated and look out for them. And there's a methodology that I've been looking into, and in fact, I'm doing a training course on it this week called outcomes harvesting, which is exactly that. And it frames it really as behavior change by people outside of your organization, right? By people outside of the project that you're involved in. So can you see observable behavior change happening? And being open to unanticipated change that you see, being open to surprising changes, even negative ones. But they have a plan and kind of have a framework for looking for those, and then nurturing them, analyzing and kind of talking about their significance and thinking about what contribution you made towards that change. So I think that's one promising approach that I think I'm looking of ways. I'd love to try a kind of pilot project, using this methodology, but I think it's one methodology that does that and helps you, yes, think about things you can put in place, but also scan the environment for things that are unanticipated, and even maybe, because you don't know. There are also negative changes that might happen, or, backlash that might happen, and those kinds of things.
Right. So if you were advising a new initiative or a campaign now, today, and we're starting from scratch, right? What are one or two practices that you would encourage them to kind of put in place, or to ensure sort of narrative change efforts are being measured over the long term?
Well, I think, try and note like what kinds of things are we looking for? What might be indications of success, and maybe think about those so that you kind of they're in your mind, right? And then put in a plan for gathering the information. So who's going to be doing that? Is it going to be, we have a staff meeting once a month and people report back on what they've observed and seen? Is someone going to be gathering, media content, whatever it is? Are we going to pay some organizations to do media monitoring for us, whatever, we're going to, whatever, who's going to get feedback on our social media, but just put in a plan in place and then do it regularly so that then gather that information. Not only what happened, as you say, I think people often just talk about, well, we had 3,000 visits to our website, or our Instagram post was, we had 5,000 likes. Well, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, that's great. Numbers don't really mean anything without context. But then go beyond the numbers, right? What did those 5,000 likes translate into? Did anyone, change their behavior? What happened besides the things that we were that we were doing that we could control? What happened outside of with events outside of our control? Did we see any change in other people's behavior, other people's media, other people's content, the way other people spoke about it? And I think that's when you start to get that impact.
Yeah, I love that. It's really, it's about like kind of that language uptake. And when you see, the metaphors that you've co-created reflected in the wild, that you're having an impact.
Rashad Robinson, who used to head Color of Change, talked about these kind of ratchet moments where you realize you've reached a threshold, something has changed, and you probably won't go back from that. So I think the example he used was, when a TV network first had a gay couple in a marriage reality show, right? And that was like, okay, this has happened. Like, we're probably not going to go back to the time when there's no gay couples in a marriage reality show. Like, that's now something new has happened. Or the first same-sex kiss on television, right? Like these ratchet moments where you go, okay, something's shifted here. Now, in those kind of cases, you can't necessarily always draw a direct line and say, well, my organization caused that big thing to happen.
Right.
But you can talk about your contribution, instead of attribution, which is what the outcomes harvesting methodology talks about. You can say, what contribution do we think we made towards that, that larger change, when it starts to get further and further away of your immediate realm of control. And so track that back and say, what role did we have in that? And sometimes you can see quite clearly what role that was, and sometimes you can't.
Yeah. Are there specific metrics or indicators like that seem to light funders up more than others? Things that folks get more excited about than others?
I don't know about that. I think, often actually, in funding organizations, what's persuasive inside a fund organization is not necessarily what equates to kind of important impact outside. So, for example, often getting an article in the New York Times is seen as great and right prestigious.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not even reaching the audience that you're trying to target, but hey, you're in the New York Times, so people tend to get excited about those things. But I think anything concrete that you can show and you can also repeat, right? And you can say, look, this is what our grantee did, look what they achieved. I think it's really useful. But really anything that, and I think it has to have some sense of this was, there was some method about this. It wasn't just random.
Mm-hmm.
It just wasn't just one random incident. We see these people have a plan. They're tracking it. These are the results they're getting. So there's a methodology behind it. There's some consistency. There's some rigor behind it. Can you substantiate the things you've said? Can you point to the link? Can you do something to show me evidence of what it is, right? It's quite surprising to me, and I've done this exercise when I was a grant maker, but then working with other grant makers, how often in grant reports, it's all about what the organization did, right? So we did the things we said we would do in the proposal, or, in the fundraising appeal.
Right.
We wrote that training manual. We produced the report. We even produced the film, whatever it was, right? It's surprising how few reports go beyond that and talk about the impact that those things had. Not only like how many people read the report, but like, did anyone comment on it? Did anyone report about it? So honestly, anything that goes beyond like talking about just what you did and actually talking about the impact that those things had goes a long way to, I think, helping funders make the case for their work and why they should continue funding it.
Yeah. I do wonder sort of the attribution contribution tension is I have never heard it articulated that way. I mean, it's a real rethink of how we report our deliverables and our outcomes. and and so I wonder, where do you begin that conversation?
Yeah, I think you have that. That's a conversation I think that you have to have with funders as well, and say like, look, let's be realistic, and that's difficult because funders have the power, they have the money, right? They decide whether to give the money or not. But have that conversation to be started and say, look, let's be realistic. Like our small organization with 10 people is not going to be able to shift like national policy all by ourselves. We're working
Right.
in an ecosystem, right? In an environment where there are other role players here. What we can tell you is what we think our contribution to that is. And I think getting away from this totally unrealistic expectation that every organization is going to just do the thing and have that big impact, And again, like the social context, policy change is complicated. There's so many interfering factors. There's no way someone could prove that the thing they did is going to, lead directly to that major policy change, unless you can say, well, I had a conversation with, this kind of representative and they decided on the spot, they told me they're going to do it. But otherwise, it's really complicated. And being realistic about that and say the best we can do is talk about our contribution, and we can provide you persuasive evidence about why we think we made this contribution.
Yeah. And two, I mean, we're talking about policy change, but there are so many other indicators of cultural shifts and changes.
Absolutely.
Do you have like sort of a framework model that you use when engaging with organizations, like to kind of walk them through all of these aspects, or is it sort of tailored specifically to the organization and issue as you get started?
I think it's sort of tailored, but as I say, I think that, there are established methodologies, but it's just like, think about that at the start, right? Don't wait until the end of this thing and say, now, how do we prove our impact? Build it into the plan from the very start. Are you clear on, what would success look like? Because often people don't even think about that. What would be indicators? What would it look like? How will we know we're heading in the right direction? So think about that right from the beginning, and then put a plan in place to track that. And that could be different for every organization. Who does it could be different, whatever it might be. But put that plan in place and make sure you do that. And do it consistently throughout your work, because again, as I say, like often people come to the end of grant period or whatever it is, or the annual appeal, and it's like, oh, how do we show our impact? But if you've been doing it every month or whatever it is, every 2 months, then you have it. And it's not so much work to remember, what happened, etc., and put it all together.
Yeah.
Even build it into your budget.
Yeah.
Don't come to the end and say, oh, where are we going to get, like, build in some money in your budget for this process of, stressing impact, so that you have it there and you can be doing it. And have that conversation again with the funder and why this is important and why you want to be able to have money to be able to sure you can show them, what's happening and how your work is progressing.
Yeah. It's so much baked into the system of how change work is organized, not just in this country, but even globally. We think in terms of even multi-year grants have a time frame. So we're trying to measure impact within that time frame, or election cycles, or whatever. So I like that. You're almost creating an internal campaign to reflect the value and validity of this external campaign.
Yeah.
I feel like as we talk about thinking of building out budgets that both include the narrative strategy and the monitoring piece and how you assess the impact, how do you make the case for a narrative strategy to their board and nonprofit leadership to start doing exactly that, to building it into their budgets?
I mean, in terms of narrative strategy broadly, I think just persuading people and boards that this is an important part, an aspect to think about when you're trying to bring about social change. I think I think making the case, there's plenty of evidence from, cognitive science to all sorts of fields around, the importance of narratives, the role they play in our thinking and the role they play in society, the role of culture, and I think if we look at politics today, the terrain of contest is narrative, it's meaning making, and kind of this is the kind of terrain where contest is happening right now. It's not so much, yes, the courts are important, all these things are important, but narrative has become really, really important, and kind of the symbols people use, the kind of how they make sense of things. We're seeing this play out in the politics sphere in a big way. And so I just feel like, honestly, if you're in the business of like social change when it comes to social justice or whatever it is, like, then, if you're building houses, fine, building houses, you don't have to worry about narrative. But if you're trying to, change big things like, how we think about poverty, how we think about health, then unless you're engaging in narrative in that field in some way or other, you kind of ceding the battle, because that's a major field of contest right now. It's all about meaning, about culture, about symbols.
Yeah. And I do feel like, so many of like nonprofit organizations often have, communications is often fused together with development. It's sometimes the team is wearing multiple hats, and part of what our ask is like, oh well, we're adding one more hat to your stack, and you should also be thinking about narrative change work. But to your point, I feel like if the organization is dedicated to making these major shifts that can be housed in a communications or external relations or development team, but it needs its own independent focus. It needs its own strategy to be built out.
Yeah, like I don't think this can be something you just tack on or ask the comms person to do if that's, unrelated to the the kind of strategic focus of the organization. It has to be part of the strategy. It has to be part of your programming. It's not just the comms thing that you talk about this at the end.
Yeah.
Not every organization needs to do it. Not every organization maybe has the capacity to do it. But again, I think we have to also get out of this thing of thinking of every organization operating alone, and trying to make change alone. So have this bigger kind of field perspective and ecosystem perspective and say, yes, if we're not doing it, is there another organization that's doing that work that you can be in alliance with, and so think about that as well in terms of broader field perspective.
I keep thinking of, as you're talking, one of the things that is coming up for me is the concept, and I learned this in the international development space, of like radical collaboration, right? So like so many organizations get siloed in what they're working on or what they're focused on, or really looking again at the attribution. This is what we were able to deliver on. And I think part of the approaches that you're sharing and just your overall vantage point is that it has to be broader. This is a broad field, and that doesn't serve us.
Yeah, I think a good example of what you're talking about is an organization providing legal services or even doing strategic litigation, right? Like that's the organization's job. Probably they're overburdened doing that. There's many people that have to help. There's lots of law cases they're involved in. Maybe don't have anyone with narrative expertise, not something they can do, can't take it on. Well then, is there another organizations working on that same issue, but focused coming from a narrative perspective that you can ally with, so that you can then, yes, you win a court case or you're providing legal assistance, but then are you also, using that to shift the narrative more broadly so that your job is made easier when it comes to the legal work? Unfortunately, I think funders impact that by, just creating this competitive environment. We're competing with each other for funding. We have to think about it differently, because no one's going to be doing it on their own, and no one ever does it on their own, right? Yeah. And then I think the other thing that my bugbear of mine is getting out of the issue silos, because everything is so interconnected. So how do we, help people connect? So yeah, I might be working on abortion, but you're working on gender, you're working on something else, but racial justice, but those are all connected. And so how do we see those connections and make sure our work is reinforcing, the others?
Fantastic. Thank you. This has been an exceptional conversation. It's been great. I'm wondering if listeners are interested in your work, in some of the writing that you've done, or even in reaching out to you, how do they find you?
You can find me at Wingseed. That's as wing of the bird, Wingseed. So like these maple seeds, they have little wings and they're like helicopters, wingseed.org. And then I also have Substack, so people can find me there or on LinkedIn.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brett, for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great, a great conversation.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX Suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.